First reading today, as Father said, this was a very troubled time for both Israel and Judah. It was the time of the divided kingdom. Judah and the tribes that associated with them were aligned against Israel and the tribes that associated with them. And at this time, the king of Israel, along with his ally Syria, king of Syria, were getting ready to come up and attack Jerusalem. And this was a very dangerous thing for the house of Judah, because if they were successful, it would be the end of the house of David. And it also then would be the end of God's promise. That is the Davidic promise that had been made, that David's house, that is a descendant of David, would rule forever, and that God would be with this descendant of David and with the house of David. So Ahaz was afraid, and Isaiah had been telling him that everything was going to be okay, that God was going to save Jerusalem. But Ahaz was still fearful, and so at that time Isaiah, of course, offered him, as we heard in the reading today. He said, well, go ahead and ask God for a sign. Whatever you ask for, he'll show you that he's going to save you. And of course, Ahaz was afraid to ask for a sign. So Isaiah, obviously exasperated by this, said, well, then God will give you a sign. He'll just give you a sign. The virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. Literally, with us is God. And he also said to Ahaz, informed him that within a few years, these kings who Ahaz was so afraid of were no longer going to exist. Their kingdoms were wiped out. And so he really didn't need to be afraid. In the Gospel of Matthew today, then, we have the account of the fact that Mary was betrothed to Joseph and that she was found with child through the Holy Spirit. And Joseph, it says, being a righteous man, was unwilling to expose her to shame, so he decided to divorce her quietly. Well, we need to understand that marriage in the culture of that time was quite a bit different than we see marriage, the marriage process now. The betrothal was actually the beginning of the process of getting married. So in that case, it was totally appropriate that Mary be called Joseph's wife, even though they were only betrothed. And it was also legal, totally legal, for Joseph or any other man in that situation to simply cancel out the marriage contract. And he could do that without giving a reason under the law. So for that reason, he would have been able to quietly, stop this process of marrying Mary, and so shield her from shame, as he said. Now, the angel appeared to Joseph by the Holy Spirit, so don't be afraid to take Mary into your house. And you are to name him Jesus. That is, Yahweh saves, because he will save his people from their sins. Now, in the second reading today, then, we have Paul beginning this letter to the Romans. And the first thing he's going to do is point out to them how Jesus fulfills the Davidic promise. First of all, that he's a descendant of David. Paul says he's descended from David according to the flesh. So that meets the first requirement. Second of all, that God would dwell with this descendant of David. And in this case, Paul says he was established as Son of God. That is, not only would God dwell with him, but he is God. And so he fulfills this promise, this Davidic promise, that the Israelites had looked forward to for so long. And that fulfillment of that promise of Jesus being descended from David according to the flesh, is what we recall at Christmas. That is the incarnation, the enfleshment, becoming flesh of God. And so in the first chapter of the Gospel of John, John says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. This incarnation then was achieved at the very moment of Jesus' conception in Mary's womb. It was totally accomplished at that point in time. And at first, Jesus was hidden from the world in Mary's womb. Eventually, he was born, and finally revealed totally and publicly during his public ministry. But from his conception to his ascension, Jesus was dwelling among men. That is, God was dwelling among us. And after Pentecost, later on then, God is dwelling within us. So first God dwelt among us, and finally God began to dwell within us, those who are baptized. Now, after Pentecost, God not only dwells within us, but he also continues to dwell among us. And he does that in the Holy Spirit. He is within us, but he is among us in the real presence of the Eucharist, of the body and blood of Christ. Here in the tabernacle, for example, and on the altar. In both those cases, the real presence is God dwelling among us. And it's interesting that whenever we consume the body and blood of Christ, for example, as we will tonight, in receiving communion, we are both recalling and reenacting God moving from dwelling among us to God dwelling within us. And when we receive the body and blood of Christ, this nourishes us. It nourishes God's life within us. Makes total sense that that would be the case. So if we can understand this moving of God dwelling among us to God dwelling within us, then we have to understand what great dignity we've been given by God dwelling within us. That's a tremendous thing. You know, when we're up here on the altar, we bow and we genuflect to the real presence. We do that to the altar, we do it to the tabernacle. But because of the dignity that's been given to each of you, we really should bow and genuflect to God's presence in you. His presence in you is as real as it is on the altar or in the tabernacle. In fact, this is really the attitude that all Christians ought to have toward each other. I know we fall far short of that, but that is the attitude we should have toward each other. We should have the same respect for each other that we have for the altar or the tabernacle. This is the dignity that Jesus purchased for us by his conception, his birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection. And this is what this whole act of God doing this for us is what we'll recall and we'll celebrate at Christmas.